The event is enough, a talk about extreme wealth and what it means to turn away from it. My name is Sunil Kumar. I label myself as an insurgent decolonial academic in the Department of Social Policy. I'm the course convener of the MSc in International Social Policy and Development, and I also run my own elective on urbanization and social policy in the Global South. People say that the chair often forgets to introduce themselves, so I made a note to do that. There are no fire alarms planned, so if there's a fire alarm, please make your way downstairs and gather at Lincoln's Inn Fields. That's the fire exit gathering place. We have a photographer here called Carl, and he's lurking in the background, and he's going to just take general pictures. So if you don't want to be photographed, just raise your hands and make yourself known to Carl. I'd like to also thank Maria and Pippa from the department, who put a lot of effort into making this event happen. It's not simple at the LSE. I've got 7 pages of chairs' briefings of what I should follow. We're going to take a couple of questions online, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And the running order is that Kate will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by Jake. So, as an insurgent decolonial academic, can I invite you as a renegade economist who's challenging a lot of the conventional wisdom of modern capitalist economics? You came up with the theory of donut economics, published a book on it, saw the economy as a balance between need and consumption, if you like, how much we can consume. You're now a practitioner helping governments, cities, companies, and communities around the world to try and align their models with balance, using models that are distributed by design. And you do this through the nonprofit that you founded, Donut Economics Action Lab. You're also a professor at Amsterdam University, and you teach a master's at the University of Oxford in environmental change and management. So please, Kate.
Thank you. I should turn this microphone on in 1 moment. Thank you very much, Sunil. Hi, it's lovely to be here. I'm really, really delighted to be here in support of this book. The book that isn't a book, that's a manuscript, that's a book that is being launched tonight. I'm really delighted to be here. And when Jake asked me to join today, I said I'd love to read it in advance. So I've really enjoyed reading it over the last week and reflecting, what do I want to bring as a response to this book? So what I'm going to share is really my response to the book and everything that I've learned through thinking about donut economics. So I'm going to be talking about, I want to stand behind this. Can I come and stand over here? Is that all right?
I can switch.
I don't like standing behind those things. There we go. I'm going to be talking about what we've inherited. Inheritance in a very broad sense. We all inherit mindsets from the culture we grow up in, from the education we get. So we inherit mindsets from the last generation, from the textbooks we're taught from. We inherit the state of a world that we find ourselves part of the institutions. But also some people inherit a lot of money. So I'm wanting to play with the idea of inheritance in different ways. And what do we do when we realize what it is we've inherited? And the different responsibilities and possibilities that come with recognizing our inheritances. When I set out to write Donut Economics, one of the things I did was read all the economics I had never been taught, which was a lot. And I also started reading economic history. Where did the ideas that I had been taught as little diagrams in textbooks, where did they actually come from? I want to play pulling out on some of that history today. So as the historian Venus Bivar says, you can denormalize almost anything by historicizing it. I love that quote. Right, so many things that we think are normal because we're born into them, a mindset, a worldview, an institution, a level of inequality, a way of being, a way of what we tell ourselves we're like, seem normal, but actually when we look into the history of these things, sometimes the history is quite bizarre and flawed or caveated, and once we understand where they came from, it really gives us a new freedom to ask ourselves, do I agree with that? Do I want to go along with that? Why on earth is that how we think? So I want to focus on denormalizing 2 things. One, who we tell ourselves we are in the realm of economics. Who do we say, humans are? What do we say people are like, especially in relation to wealth? And the second one, what are the stories we tell ourselves or have been told about the evolutions of inequality and how it will move and shape? So I'm going to look at those two histories playfully. So, who do we think we are? Who has economics told us we are? Well, anybody here who ever studied economics, if you studied like I did, we learned the kind of character of rational economic man, and I think it's really interesting to ask, where did he come from? And I want to go back into pre-economic thinking, back to the philosopher David Hume. Hume said, there is some benevolence, however small, infused into our bosom, some spark of friendship for humankind, some particle of the dove kneaded into our frame, along with elements of the wolf and serpent. Very poetic, right? We have within us the dove and the serpent. We all know this in us. Anyone who's raised kids knows that, we can see it, and we don't even need to look at our kids, we can look at ourselves. We can see it, and we're nurturing, we try to nurture that dove. But they're both in there, and so we're complex, and can be unpredictable in how we're going to respond to things. So Adam Smith comes along, and before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I think he echoes what Hume said. Smith said that self-interest is of all virtues that which is most helpful to the individual. But he ranked above that humanity, justice, generosity, and public spirit. These are the qualities most useful to others. So again, he's echoing human nature is the self-interest, but also the collective interest, the public good. We've got both sides in us, which I think is morally rich and well observed, but it's not very useful if you want to make a theory that can predict, because this is unpredictable. How will this person respond? So along comes John Stuart Mill, who, when I was a philosophy student, I liked some of the stuff that Mill did, but Mill does here something really unhelpful. He wanted to separate moral philosophy from political economy, what we now have made economics. He wanted this separation. And in the spirit of, making it technical and scientific, Mill does something super unhelpful. He says, political economy does not treat the whole of man's nature, nor the whole of his conduct in society. It is concerned with him solely as a being who desires to possess wealth. I mean, that's massive. Mill says, forget that public spirit, forget that dove. That, maybe we could leave that to moral sentiment and moral philosophy. When we're doing political economy, we're just treating humans as a being who desires to possess wealth. Wow. That's a real strip down of the potential of human beings. And then Marshall, and I'm so glad we're in the Marshall building. Let's bring Alfred Marshall in. Then Marshall adds, oh no, before I go to Marshall, so Mill's contemporary say, John Stanton Davis, he said, you have created a ridiculous Homo economicus. You have created the dollar-hunting man. This was a joke, Homo economicus. It was a mockery. And it's as if economists went, oh, that sounds quite professional, actually. Let's take that. Yes, we'll do Homo economicus. And Mill said, no political economist would be so absurd to actually think that this is how people are actually constituted, but this is the mode in which science must necessarily proceed. We must create this stripped-down model. This is the only way we can move forward to modeling. Thank you, Mill. And then along comes Mr. Marshall. And he says, human wants and desires are countless in number and very various in kind. He talks about man in every step in his progress upward increases the variety of his needs. He desires a greater choice of things and things that will satisfy new wants growing up in him. So adding to that desire to possess wealth, Marshall adds insatiability, that we can never have enough. There's no point of enough or sufficiency, that this is what the model will be. So more is always better. And to me, those two traits put together they're two of many traits that were added into the character of rational economic man, along with perfect foresight, calculating. But they're extraordinary attributes to give ourselves and say this is who we are. Now, Robert Frank comes along as an economist today doing research, and he and many others have found, these models aren't just models that we can observe, they change us. So the models we make of ourselves remake us, as he said. our beliefs about human nature help shape human nature itself. His research found that the more that students learn about this character of rational economic man, from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 of their economic studies, the more they say they value self-interest over altruism, the more they value competition over collaboration. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. The theory has shaped us to become desirous of wealth and with no satiation. I'm going to jump from holding this character in mind. What are the stories we've been telling ourselves about inequality and how it evolves? Well, let's jump back to an old debate. Karl Marx, and I've just used a little sort of systems loop diagram here. So Karl Marx believed that the reinforcing feedback of capital... Ooh, something's happened to my slide. Okay, I'll just explain. Capital, this should say profit here. So capital and profit. More capital gives me more profit gives you more capital. The success to the successful, right? So Marx said, we are going to see divergence in society because those with capital will gain more. This is the core of his thesis. We're going to see divergence. Marshall said, no, we'll see convergence because he believed in what he called economic chivalry. He believed that the more wealth people had, the more that they would invest it for the public good, even though he simultaneously had their wants being unsated. So there's something contradictory going on here. But he believed they would converge. No, we don't need to redistribute. We can keep growing the economy and allow wealth to accumulate because people will have economic chivalry and they will invest in the public good the more wealth they have. So this debate goes on. Then along comes Vilfredo Pareto, and he says, actually, I've looked at some data from Italian towns and principalities, and it's a kind of 80-20 ratio. It's going to be fixed. Deal with it. But then we get Simon Kuznets. And in 1955, he gathered a little bit of data, and this is literally his data. I mean, this is the data he had. That's one paragraph. It's all the data he had from the UK, US, and Germany, looking from around 1913 to around 1947. And he says, I think I see a trend. I think I'm seeing across these three countries, the relative distribution of income has been moving towards equality. Now, the first thing is he's surprised. This is not what he expected. He tries to explain it by sort of urban-rural migration. And he also gives us plenty of caveats. He says, this is 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, some of it possibly tainted with wishful thinking. Wishful thinking, yes, that as economies get richer, things will get better. It's perilously close to guesswork, to pure guesswork. And please, he says, don't make any unwarranted generalizations. Oh, poor Simon Kuznets. Because that's exactly what happened. He never drew this curve, but this was the curve, the Kuznets curve, that was drawn on the back of that paper that whispers out this promise that if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute because you see societies will even up again. Growth evens itself up. And this underpins at least half a century of trickle-down economics. A rising tide lifts all boats. The austerity, you know, we've got to go through the pain. We'll come out in the sunny uplands together. This curve, even though the evidence was very scant, as he said, all the caveats himself, but it underpins so much political rhetoric. So then along comes Thomas Piketty. And he says, you know what? I've looked back at the numbers. I've got a lot more data now. And Kuznets was right. That is what was happening in the trends in those countries. But he was also right that it was a very particular moment in time. He had data from pre-World War I to post-World War II. And it was war that destroyed the capital of the wealthy. It was post-World War II that governments invested heavily in health and education and housing. So it was war, not the workings of the market, that evened things up. This doesn't just happen. And he then showed us in more detail, say, you know, look, over time, the levels of equality and inequality within a nation, within Europe and the US here, it changes. It's not fixed, like Pareto said. It changes, and policy can change it. He also said, well, let's not just focus on who earns what. Let's look at who owns what, right? So he, again, gathered data not just on income, but also on wealth, and starts tracking, again, wealth, levels of wealth of the very wealthy, changes over time. It isn't fixed. It can be changed. In his wealth, he's counting real estate, financial assets, business assets, private assets. And of course, he wasn't the first to notice that wealth is really the underlying driver of inequalities. Let's go back to John Stuart Mill. He wrote, landlords grow richer, as it were, in their sleep, without working, risking, or economizing. And one of my very favorite early acts of political campaigning happened in Rockford, Illinois in 1914. A man called Fay Lewis bought a plot of land, and he put on it this giant billboard, right? It says, everybody works but the vacant lot. I pay $3,600 for this lot and will hold till I get $6,000. The profit is unearned increment made possible by the presence of this community and enterprise of its people. I take the profit without earning it. For the remedy, read Henry George. And Henry George had written Poverty in Progress and was calling for a land value tax. But this is just brilliant. You know, led by donkeys would be proud of this guy, right? This is projecting your political message. I just buy the land and I am earning, because that is the way that wealth works. So, Michael Hudson brings us up to the present and says, well, just as owning land did that in the past, just as landlords were the archetypal rentiers of their agricultural society, so investors, financiers, and bankers are the largest rentier sector of today's financialized economies. So this is how it accumulates, and here's data from the World Inequality Report globally. In simple terms, the bottom 50% of people captured 2% of global wealth growth between 1995 and 2021. And the top 1% captured 38% of global wealth growth. And there's a tiny percentage of the tiny top percentage who are asking themselves, what have we inherited? And what should we do with it? And I found that fascinating, really. This is some of the people who Jake has been talking with and writing about in the book. So what should we do with it? And what should we do with the state of the world we've inherited? So let me bring this back around. Here's a world we could aim for, one possible compass, a donut that invites us to leave no one falling short on life's essentials in the hole in the middle, but not overshooting the planetary boundaries. So it centers human and planetary thriving, meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. If we take that as a possible goal, the trouble is that we're very, very far from that right now. Billions of people falling short on life's essentials, overshooting many planetary boundaries. And companies have been contributing, right? So the returns of financial assets are contributing this. And all of these headlines are from this year. So you've got Shell waters down net zero targets as it moves away from renewables. Okay, you might say, well, I didn't expect anything else from Shell. Okay, let's turn to a poster child of the business world, Unilever. ESG, economic social governance, poster child Unilever waters down green pledges. Even Unilever are pulling back from their commitments. We've got global circularity is falling steadily per year. It's less than 10%. It was about 9%, and now it's falling. So the actual circular rate of materials is not rising, it's falling. Nearly 240 major corporations are missing their deadline under the Science-Based Targets Initiative of committing on their carbon emissions cuts. They all made a flurry of promises to cut their emissions, and now are just pulling back. Everyone else is pulling back. I can pull back. It's safe. Everyone's pulling back. Dividend payments soar globally as worker pay stagnates. The world's 5 richest men double their money as the poorest get poor, and the S&P 500 hits new all-time high. This is just the dynamics. This is the dynamics of the systems we've inherited, piling on to this already situation in crisis. Right? This is a world that's deeply degenerating the living planet, and we need to regenerate. It's a world that's deeply divisive, and we need to make it far more distributive. At Donut Economics Action Lab, when we work with companies, we always say to them, we want to talk about the deep design of your business. We don't want to talk about your products. We want to talk about how your business is designed. We often encounter people who say, how much value can we extract from this enterprise? And that's actually it's the underlying question in many, many, many businesses. They'll often say it's their legal fiduciary duty to ask that question. But then you can meet people who are asking a completely different question. How many benefits can we generate through this enterprise? What else could this business do? And we think it comes down to 5 design traits of the company. What is the purpose of the company? It's networks of relationships, how it's governed, how it's owned, and fundamentally how it's financed. So we spend a lot of time talking with companies about the deep design of business. But I want to land here and end here by taking this very same framework and bringing it to the world of wealth holding, which is the world that Jake brings us to in this book. Because I've met wealth holders. The organization I co-founded is funded by philanthropists, and I've done workshops for philanthropists and been in spaces with people talking about their relationship to wealth, and totally fascinated that in the same room you have such different mindsets. I was at one workshop where a member of a family said, growing our capital is the family DNA. Spending it down would be like killing my father. And I was just so struck by that. This is rational economic man. This is what Mill told us. Well, you know, who we just consider as being who desires to possess wealth, and it's insatiable, and this becomes the family DNA. And how can that psychology is sitting side by side with somebody, and this is a quote from the last page of this book, somebody who says, it's not about us and our family, it's about society we want to be in, to live in. Bringing back that dove, bringing back that public spirit, the generosity. How do we open up at the level of the individual, right? This is landing with people who have accumulated or found themselves born into or earning vast amounts of wealth. The deep psychology that lies there. And the last thing I want to say here is thinking about that deep psychology. I often use this to demonstrate thinking about moving from a divisive to a distributive economy, right? So in a divisive economy, it's like captured. I'm going to pretend to be this person. Growing our capital is the family DNA. I've got to grow this capital. Spending it down would be killing my father. I have to keep this going. It's my job. That's what I'm here. That's what it's to be the legacy of my generation, to keep spending this up. But the freedom of somebody who says, wow, thank you, father. Thank you, grandfather. I know you intended to do well by us. And I can now do this. And I can just let that go. And the joy, right? And you meet other wealth holders like, I can't believe I have the privilege to let that go and to put that in the world and to put that in the hands of people who are going to do transformative things with that. So I'm personally fascinated by the very different mindsets of people who find themselves in these situations. And some must defend a family legacy, and others have that freedom to let it go. So, Jake, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I'm just going to introduce you to Jake Hayman. Jake has spent more than 2 decades working alongside the world's richest people to try and help them to align their values with their wealth. A social entrepreneur from Camden, he's helped establish and grow 10 different social enterprises focused on social and environmental justice. Jake's latest project, Impatience, Insiders, is galvanizing people working inside finance, management consulting, advertising, public affairs, and food systems to take collective action towards a just transition. Jake wrote a book on people walking away from extreme wealth that was due to be published this summer, but fears of litigation from wealth holders and investment bankers mentioned it meant that the publishers withdrew their contract. So this is fears of litigation. It's not actual litigation or there being no case for litigation. It's just the act of litigation that can cause a lot of angst and anxiety. So there are only 500 copies of this unpublished manuscript. I think this is the first time that LSE has got a manuscript launch program, and that says a lot about the politics of what Jake's talking about. So this book was meant to be in shops in Dublin some months ago. However, from long delay, it wasn't there. But it's here in front of you. So Jake, all yours.
Thank you.
Switched on.
Sounds like it. Okay. I think we're good. I'll just grab on that. It's okay. So, thank you, Sunil. It's a real honour for me to be here alongside you and alongside Kate and at the London School of Economics and with all of you today. 22 years ago, I was a student and walked into a room much like this and heard someone speak who I thought was incredible. And 12 months later, 21 years ago, he'd been convinced after a lot of nagging and emails and things to give me an internship. And I went to work for him. And 20 years ago, he stumbled across a granola bar that he liked. He plugged that into the supply chain of his business. And within a couple of years from then, he was a billionaire. And that led to me having quite a strange career of exposure to some of the world's wealthiest people. And for the past 20 years, I've sat alongside wealthy individuals and families as they've navigated this question of how do I show up as a good citizen in the world whilst I have all of this money and all of these resources that others don't have access to. And a lot of them found it, in my experience, an unbelievably exhausting wrestle, a difficult time trying to find that alignment, starting with philanthropy inevitably, and then trying to get into ethical investment, ethical tax, ethical wealth levels and wealth planning. And in the end of it all, they just couldn't reach a moment where they could feel well aligned between the world they wanted to live in and the money that they have. And they decided to walk away from the wealth completely. And it's their stories that I tell in the book. And one of the things that struck me most over the last 20 years of working with people in this strange situation that they're put in by virtue of their own endeavor or enterprise or inheritance or whatever it may be, is that when you sit with them and ask them to close their eyes and imagine the world as they'd like to see it in 25 years' time and think about what an aspirational vision in their mind's eye could look like, they all describe the same thing. And they describe nature, they describe vibrancy, they describe community, and they describe walking down into a high street and seeing local economy. And I asked them to describe the homes that they see. And they're all about the same. No one sees themselves in a gated mansion, and no one looks out the window upon a tower block. There isn't a private jet or a yacht in sight. And yet, when those people stopped that visualization process and turned on their emails and picked up their phones, the people on the other side of it were there working, endeavoring to make them richer and richer and richer and take them further and further away from that world that they want to see. And it's something of a career ender in the world of working with rich people to write a book about rich people. And so even though this won't be published, I'm pretty sure that it's the end of the line for me in terms of working alongside wealth holders, which is nice for me because it means that I get to speak to you all with a bit of freedom this evening. And I just want to talk about three things. One is where we are, which Kate has covered, so I can move quickly through. The second is how did we get here in terms of those mechanisms that connect extreme wealth and poverty. And the third is what we do about it. So Kate's already covered a lot of the global picture, but I just want to touch on the UK a moment. Nationally, 1% of people, the richest 1%, hold the same amount of wealth as 70% of the rest of the population. And what's happening here and in many other countries is a phenomenon whereby the ratio between public wealth and private wealth is transforming. So it used to be that there was a lot of money in public coffers and less in private hands. And over the last 50 years, the amount of money in the public coffers and the amount of wealth that we have at a public level has shrunk, and the amount in private hands has grown exponentially. And within that growth, there's been a concentration. And the number of people who have access to wealth has shrunk, and that money has concentrated amongst fewer and fewer and concentrated within geographies and demographies that have served to the exclusion of many. And that means that given that the easiest way to make money is to have it in the first place, it means that even if we had, for example, a completely racially just society tomorrow with no prejudice whatsoever, we would never get to a point of outweighing the inequalities that exist, because they're baked into the starting point where certain groups have an unbelievable advantage and others have historically been denied from that. In Camden, where I'm from, 40% of people live in poverty. 60% of those people have someone working in their home. It's an insult to the idea of much of the mainstream economic theory around poverty and wealth. 40% of kids are growing up in overcrowded houses. I've seen queues at food banks in Camden and Islington where I've volunteered at them, and I do not have a single one of my friends who I went to school with who lives in the borough of Camden. And I was thinking about it today, and I'm not sure that there's a single kid from my year who lives in the borough of Camden anymore. It's an economic transformation of the area, and yet for all of those terrible factors about the borough, if I had to describe it economically in one word, I'd call it rich, because the money is there. It's just who has access to it has shifted. And this is the thing. The most crucial point that I've landed on is that this is the first time in my adult life where extreme wealth and extreme poverty are rising in synchrony. They are interconnected and interrelated. And there are some reasons why extreme wealth has risen that don't connect to extreme poverty, but there are a handful of reasons, places where these two things are directly interwoven. And I just want to touch on the 5 key areas where I see that to be true. The first is around how companies run and the idea of shareholder primacy. So many of the people in the room will know the story of when Ford Motor Cars had a good year and the CEO said, this is great, we can pay all of our workers some more money and give them rewards and bonuses and everything else. And the shareholders said, no, it's great because we can take that money as dividend and profit as shareholders. And there was a face-off between the two, and it led to a court case which the judge ruled in favour of the owners and set in train this idea of shareholder primacy, or at least accelerated that train. And that train has led us to the externalization of environmental costs and the destruction of the planet in aid of shareholder profits, and the decimation of worker rights in aid of shareholder profits, 2 things that do connect us back to extreme poverty. The second thing is around executive pay. So in the 1980s, a CEO might earn about 20 times the average salary of one of the people working in their business. You know, the 80s was not a communist era. That's a lot of money, 20-fold increase. Today, that number is more than 125 times if you look across the FTSE companies. And it's not just the CEOs who are earning that money, and it's not just the earnings that matter, but it's the fact that they're now partaking in the ownership. They're switching sides from being part of the staff team who can represent themselves against the owners, or at least hold their ground in conversations, to being owners themselves. And that shrinks the organising power and the power of staff, which has led to the degradation of worker rights in this country. The third area is tax. We have a system where we like to tax work over wealth in this country, which again prejudices those who have money in the first place, and where we do have an incredible progressive tax, which is the inheritance tax, which means that if you read it in one sentence, 40% of the money when you die is going to go back into public coffers and should serve as an equalizing kind of backstop for our economy and our society. It's not functioning. And it's not functioning because when someone has 2 million quid in their estate and they die, around 1 million of it goes tax-free, which everyone's entitled to, which is fine, which is why 95% plus of people never pay inheritance tax. And the next is going to be taxed at the 40% rate. So they'll pay a net rate of 20%. Now, as you go up in wealth, that number should go up because it's a higher percentage of that money taxed at the 40% rate. However, what happens is once you go to more than £10 million, and Aaron Advani's done incredible research into this, the rate doesn't keep going up. In fact, it falls, and it falls in half from 20% to 10%. And what's the difference there? Well, it's the intervention of the advisory industry, of lawyers and accountants and family offices and people structuring your money in ways to keep it away from the public purse. And so whilst poor people pay taxes and middle class people pay taxes, rich people pay lawyers so that they don't have to. The fourth thing is around a temporal inequality, and Roman Kusnerich writes brilliantly about this in his book, The Good Ancestor, but we are prejudicing the lives of people today without respect to the lives of people who've gone past and without service of the lives of people coming into the future. And what that means is that we make decisions around what we spend money on with an economic discounting that cares much less about my kid in 50 years' time or their kid or the future generations, anyone's kids, than it does about people today, and fails to look at the historic injustices that have set up a system of economic inequality, fails to address the reparations connected to slavery or colonialism or anything else which puts a structural barrier from reaching any sort of baseline equality in today's society. And the fifth thing is connected to crises. There have been two big financial crises over the past 20 years or so. One was the 2008 crash and the second was COVID. And in both, the government implemented a policy of quantitative easing to try and save the economy. For right or for wrong, and without meaning to, that money wasn't intended for the super rich, and yet the nature of the economy meant that it gravitated towards them. So the biggest enriching moments of the last 20 years have been crises of the financial crash and COVID, and nothing for me proves more clearly that we don't live in a time of trickle-down economics, but we live in a time of hoover-up economics. And not only that, but Gary Stevenson, who's written a brilliant book on this topic, explains that when wealth holders get more money, what do they do with it? They don't spend it in the economy like people who have reasonable amounts of money do. They put it into assets because they don't need any more spending money. And so they buy real estate, and so they buy stocks and buy shares. And as they do, the prices of those assets go up, and that makes them less affordable to people who never had assets in the first place, and it makes the people who had assets richer and richer and richer, and we're trapped in this cycle. And wealth holders often try to respond to the cycle by saying, okay, I'm going to use my assets and put them in ethical investment and ESG funds instead of just the standard investments. But what happens is that they tend to be missold products by their financial advisors and by their bankers and by their investment managers. So when they walk in and walk out of a meeting and say, this is brilliant, I'm doing ethical investment, they don't realize that they're neither doing investment, because they're not investing in anything, they're just speculating on asset prices in secondary markets, and they're not doing anything ethical, they're just doing something comparatively less unethical to the mainstream of the FTSE 500. And all of this happened, all of these five things took place in a period of time where our universities, our school, our media, and of course our politics became more and more influenced by the super rich. Over the course of the first 20 years of this century, 20% of all political donations in this country came from 10 men. I honestly don't know what's worse, of the arms race of the US where they throw billions at each other, or the fact that our democracy can be bought so cheap by just 10 men. And it obviously has a huge impact on the infrastructure for these decisions. And so just to finish on what needs to change, I want to touch quickly on three things. The first is that I'll be surprised if anyone in this room can tell me what the government's aspiration is for the level of inequality in this country. And if we wanted to find out what the government's aspiration is, who would we ask? Because there is no minister for extreme wealth, and there is no ministry for inequality. We have ministers for every one of our major functions of business and universities and schools and agriculture, and yet as all of this money has gravitated towards this small number of people, there is no one responsible in government for saying whether or not we are happy with the concentration of wealth in their hands, what our aspiration is for the redistribution of that wealth, if there is any, or why we think that that wealth is a good thing, if we do think it's a good thing. And that means there's no accountability, and all we get is generic slogans about levelling up or a more equal society without any framework to hold people accountable to what that actually means. And so we need a minister, a department, a function within government that sets an agenda for which it can be accountable and which it can need to economically justify. The second thing we need to do, in my mind, is to organise. We need mass citizen conversations. We need town halls and meetings like this one going on all around the country, and we need citizens' assemblies on what we think the answer should be and where we'd like to get the economy and our society to. And the reason that that is so important is I don't think that we can afford to make the mistake that the left makes too often, which is to presume that everyone's going to agree with us. And I tell you that if I go back into my old school in Camden Town now and stand up and say, I'm here advocating for this more equal society and we're going to redistribute, and someone else walks in and says, I'm a businessman and this guy is trying to cut off your one chance of making it rich. I came from around here, I've made it rich, I've had my shot, you could have your shot too. Don't let these guys cut you off at the knees. Don't let them take away your chance to aspire. Don't let them take away your opportunity to get rich too. And he's got a point. And he's going to win the vote in that classroom. And so we need to have fundamental and deep conversations in order to build a popular mandate if we can get one for this work. And then finally, we need to recruit and hold accountable those power holders, the people in the advisory industry, the wealth holders, and the corporate leaders who make decisions about money. And we need to sell them on the vision that we're proposing, if indeed there is a we and there is a shared vision. And we need to try and see whether we can take more people along with us, because there is nothing worse than forgetting that there are lots of people out there who are in these institutions of power or have huge amount of wealth, who close their eyes and see that world that you want to live in as much as they do. And so it's a conversation about tactics often rather than a conversation about morality, which is why referring to Elon Musk is so completely unhelpful to the broader conversation. And we also need to bring in, as well as the engagement, the accountability. I was speaking to a brilliant friend, Anna Fielding, about this yesterday, and I was talking about how we need to put under the microscope every decision to pay every executive how much money, how much to shareholders, how is cash being allocated, who owns land, who's owning houses, on every street, in every business, on every decision, in a way that is exhausting, in order to bring back into community social accountability around choices around money, because these are all just choices. It's not the economy, it's the choices that we make. And she gave me the beautiful line that we need to systematically and relentlessly problematize what's taken as normal. Thank you.